Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Yorkshire Museum. My name's Lucy, I'm one of the curators here, and I'm very happy to welcome Antony Lee, who's going to be speaking to us this afternoon. This is the seventh, actually, of our series of online events, which we have hosted to celebrate an important acquisition at the Yorkshire Museum and also our brand new exhibition, the Ryedale Hoard, a Roman Mystery, which is on display at the Yorkshire Museum until spring of next year. Welcome to those of you joining us on both Facebook and YouTube. Do put your comments in the comment boxes. We'd love to know where you're joining us from. And also do remember to add your questions and comments about Antony's talk throughout. A few practicalities. The talk will last around 45 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. So please do add those into the comments, and I'll share some of them with Antony at the end of the talk. And if you do experience any technical issues during the talk, I really hope you don't, but don't worry. Antony has kindly agreed that this talk can be recorded and it will be available for you to watch afterwards on our YouTube channel. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Antony Lee to the virtual Yorkshire Museum this afternoon. Antony is a Roman archaeologist and an experienced museum curator. He's associate of the Chartered Institute for Archaeology, an associate of the Museums Association, and a fellow of the Royal Numismatic Society. So lots of letters to add to the end of your name. Spent 15 years as archaeology curator for Lincolnshire Museum, developing the fantastic displays at the collection in Lincoln and managing and sharing the large and significant archaeological collections from the Roman Colonia itself and the wider county. And Antony also spent time as the Regional Collections Development Officer for Renaissance East Midlands in Derby. He's the author of several subject specialist papers, so do give him a Google after this talk. And he also authored the fantastic popular book, The Treasures of Roman Lincolnshire, which is part of a series that also includes York, I should add. Antony recently started in a new role as Treasure Trove Officer at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, dealing with public archaeological finds. And he took up this role having just completed a PhD at Durham University. Congratulations, Antony. And the themes of this PhD will be explored in our talk this afternoon, which has the title of Dead Gods, Presenting Romano-British Religious Experiences in Museums. So without further ado, over to you, Antony.
Lovely, thank you very, very much. Right, let me do the obligatory screen share. I hope everything works okay. Right, can you see what hopefully you can see a title slide?
Yes, we can. That's
excellent
great
stuff. Lovely. Brilliant. Well, yes, thank you, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you to Lucy for the invitation and for the very kind introduction. So yes, what I'm talking about this afternoon is my PhD research into Romano-British religion in museums. Scholarly approaches to the Roman world and to Roman Britain more particularly have changed considerably in recent decades, but it's debatable as to what extent those changes and those new ways of thinking have impacted on more popular perceptions of the period. And of course, museums are very important ways for presenting the archaeological heritage of Roman Britain to the public and interpreting it. So the quote that's on screen at the moment by David Clarke and Fraser Hunter back in 2001 saying, despite the growing challenges to orthodox interpretations of Roman Britain, there's been surprisingly little commentary on the impact these may have had on the presentations of the subject offered to a wider public by museums. Unfortunately, 22 years later, that remains depressingly accurate. And that's kind of the starting point for my research, is to look into the way that museums are presenting Roman Britain. And I'm particularly interested in the lens of religion, to look at how they do that. I want to say before we kind of get into the meat and the detail of it, that even though I'm going to be looking at specific museum displays this afternoon and perhaps even being critical of one or two, but I don't think museums have done anything wrong in what they do. And I certainly hope it's not seen in that light. What I hope to do is challenge some of the more traditional paradigms and approaches to displaying religion in Roman Britain, and highlighting the potential that I think exists for looking and thinking differently about religion, and even how some of the older views of the Roman world can still persist, even inadvertently, in the ways we approach religion. So to talk a little bit about the kind of scope and scale of the research before getting into some of the more meaty and hopefully interesting examples. The research was done, as inevitably was the case, during the COVID lockdowns. It was 23 museums that I did surveying of, which you can see here on the map. I'm very, very pleased with the museums I was able to survey in terms of their scope and their representativeness, but obviously there are museums that I would have loved to have included, including the Yorkshire Museum itself, you'll notice is missing, that the COVID pandemic just didn't make possible. But there we are, we've got to live with these things. It's not going to be of huge relevance to the talk, but I will just explain the 4 different colours and the categories that I use, just to sate your curiosity. Category A museums, the yellow dots, are specialist Roman museums, ones that their remit is specifically an aspect of Roman Britain. The category B museums, the red ones, are national museums, so the British Museum and National Museum of Scotland in this case. The category C museums, they're perhaps the broadest category, so that represents local and regional museums, so local authority museums, university museums are in that category as well. And then category D, the blue dots, are site museums, so museums specifically attached to Romano-British archaeological sites. In terms of the theoretical positioning of the thesis, and don't worry, I will not be dwelling too much and too long on this, but in defining my discussions of new ways of thinking about religion in Roman Britain and the Roman world and thinking about religious experience, I wanted to draw on quite a few different complementary and actually quite current and evolving theoretical areas of study. So the main circles here are the ones to focus on. So we have, for example, developments in archaeologies of religion and ritual more generally, how we think about how we can access the spiritual through the archaeological record. Studies of post-colonial Roman archaeology in Britain. Studies of meaning making in museums, so how museum interpretation and museum visitors interact, how do people look at displays and move through them and make meanings from what they're seeing. And then on the left, a bit more of a mixed bag of ontological studies of the materiality of archaeology and of sensory archaeologies, all complementary ways of thinking about how human beings and the world interact. And that's been a big shift in archaeological thinking in recent years, trying to decenter the importance of humans and see us more as creatures that interact with and are influenced by our environments, and that can even include spiritual environments. And so trying to chart a course through all of those very interesting and dynamic areas to think about how I'm considering religion. One particularly important one I just want to focus on a touch more before moving on is, you can see at the top right there, hopefully, where it says lived ancient religion, as existing at the intersection between archaeologies of religion and ritual and post-colonial Romano-British archaeology. So that was particularly important and influential on the research. So I will just say a little bit more about that. It's the name given specifically to a project that ran at the University of Erfurt in Germany between 2012 and 2017, but takes its name and its inspiration from the anthropological concept of lived religion, which is something that started in the late 1990s, particularly in North America, looking at the way that we study contemporary religion. So some of the principles that you'll see here I'll just talk through, but it's applying some of these principles to religion in the ancient world. So lived religion and lived ancient religion means taking a bottom-up perspective rather than a top-down one. So rather than looking at churches and religious institutions, it means looking from the perspective of individuals. How do they construct their own religious landscapes? And there's a surprising diversity of beliefs and practices that appear when you do that. Even people who belong to what seem quite defined religious organizations have an amazing diversity and a lot of, I don't want to call it cherry picking, but a lot of individual choice over how they engage with different aspects of the spiritual. So taking that kind of approach. The second point is considering religion as something that's always in the making. So always dynamic, always shifting, always maintaining and developing its relevance to its practitioners and in the world. So that means that every religious act is one of creative performance, and every religious act has the potential to change the way that that act and other acts are conducted in the future by that same person or by other members of the community. So how religions spread and grow and develop themselves and individuals. And then thirdly, the idea that religious activity and religious beliefs are not discrete or detached in any way from the rest of the world and of human culture and society. They're in constant negotiation with other social, political, and economic activity. You can't sacrifice an object or a material to a deity unless you actually are able to acquire that object. And religious authority, religious power is intrinsically associated with social and political power and those networks. So considering religious activity as fully entwined with the rest of human activity. And it seems obvious, but in studies, it's often detached as its own discrete area of life, which is just not realistic. So all those kind of key areas are fundamental to the way I've approached religion in Roman Britain and thinking about how we can use these sorts of principles for presenting it to our visitors in museums. To return to the quote I mentioned at the start, and the idea that the way we consider Roman Britain has changed. This is the kind of traditional school textbook view of Roman Britain and the invasion of Roman Britain. And ideas of religious identity and religious practices and how they change, how they stay the same, have been central to these new ideas. So a lot of it's been involved in challenging overly simplified identities, such as concepts of Romans and natives. And even though you see them used a lot, the concept of the Romans is used repeatedly and very popularly. But when you actually start to break down what defines a Roman and who might have used that identity and in what circumstances, it becomes an awful lot more complicated. So the scholarly turn has been very much about challenging these ideas and challenging this idea that the Romans were, in true Monty Python fashion, the sophisticated bringers of towns, roads, architecture, stable government, economics, art, literacy, togas, baths, etc. In other words, the proactive and very mobile providers of civilization. And native populations that the Romans encountered, including those of Britain, become characterized as semi-naked, spiky-haired, tattooed, boat-painted, dirty, savage, illiterate barbarians. In other words, the static and very passive receivers of the civilization that's being offered, and the idea that they would naturally want to adopt it and want to improve themselves through it. So these very problematic but very, very pervasive views of identities in the ancient world. But they are indeed very pervasive. And one thing I noticed when I was looking at the museums was one particular term that kept on coming up, which was tolerance, particularly in relation to the tolerance of the Roman state towards the religious practices, beliefs, deities that the Roman world encountered as it expanded. So this idea of tolerating religious diversity, giving peoples a high level of religious freedom. The problem with this narrative is that it grants all agency for both change and continuity to the Roman state. It doesn't really allow for the actions of any other individuals or groups. And while we can't deny the very actual or at least implied military and administrative violence that the Roman state might offer to people who dissented against it, and we certainly shouldn't seek to ignore it, the reality is that this view implies a level of centralized control and of religious policy making that seems to be quite beyond what was feasible throughout the provinces. But this view does serve to reinforce a very Roman-centric view of the world based on benign and tolerant imperialism, as I say, underplaying the agency that individual local communities had to determine their own religious practices, beliefs, etc. And the dominance of the classical world and the classical pantheon in terms of religion is absolutely clear. This graph here is from an online survey that I did during the PhD research, where, as one of the questions, respondents were given a list of 30 deities, all attested in Roman Britain and from different cultural backgrounds. They were presented in alphabetical order, so without any indication of what their background was. But then for this graph, I've divided them up so that the red lines are the classical pantheon deities, the green bars are the Eastern deities. So, for example, mystery cult deities, the ones that generally grew in the east of the Greco-Roman world and spread to popularity throughout. And then the blue is the native deities of the northwestern provinces. And it quite clearly shows that whereas deities such as Minerva, Jupiter, Mars, etc., get near 100% recognition from respondents, and the entire top half of the graph effectively is the classical or the Eastern deities, the native deities suffer from almost negligible recognition in some cases. There is a clear disparity between people's popular recognition of the classical deities and the more localized native deities. And we can question kind of how museums are perhaps contributing, or at least not entirely challenging, the dominance of the classical pantheon. So from the museums I surveyed, the deities that are being presented to the public, 64% of them were classical deities, with only 18% being native deities. And this doesn't just include objects, this includes references on text panels and things as well. So where museums are not just restricted by the objects in their collections, but have the ability to talk more widely about the way that religion worked and was experienced in the ancient world. So we see this classical dominance carrying through into displays. We also see it in the way that displays are presented and the way that graphics work. This is a display from the Roman Army Museum on Hadrian's Wall. And even though none of the objects, none of the altars or the small finds in the case to the bottom right actually include objects dedicated to Minerva, Jupiter, and Mars, who were the three marbled deities in the backdrop, you can see the sense that these, marbled classical gods are sitting physically and conceptually above everything else. The visitors can't help but get the impression that these deities are perhaps culturally, religiously superior, despite not being actually present and attested in the displays. So as much as this is a stunning and very, very visually attractive and appealing display, it does reinforce messages about hierarchies of religion in the Roman world that perhaps aren't really reflected in the communities, in this case, one of the communities of Hadrian's Wall, and the actual religious beliefs that are being evidenced in the archaeological record. So a danger there of introducing hierarchies based on the cultural origins of deities. And that follows through with another example here. This is at the Durham University Archaeology Museum, where we have this lovely little stone sculpted head, most likely locally produced in the Northeast. A classical head in almost every form except for the eyes. You can hopefully see the wonderfully large lentoid eyes, which are quite characteristic of a lot of locally produced art. And even though the sculpture has been quite clearly able to produce a lovely depiction of a hairstyle, the earrings, the face, the depiction of the large eyes has been deliberate and important. We see this on native art for a reason. There is a particular symbolism to do with the eyes and the way that particular sensing organ, relates to the rest of the body and to the worldview of the artist and the people intended to receive and interpret this image. There is a painted reconstruction of the head displayed next to it, and you might instantly recognize what I'm going to say next, which is whereas the repainting is lovely, but you can see that those lovely big intentional lentoid eyes have been replaced with repainted small eyes of classical proportions. So expectations of classical perfection and classical realism have overridden in this reconstruction the actual archaeological evidence, which had a different message to tell. The original artist's message has been overridden in the interpretation by that classical expectation. So again, a danger of our expectation and of introducing hierarchies of importance. This display is at Tully House Museum in the Frontier Gallery there. You can see the overall display titled Nasty Little Brits, which is a reference to the wonderful Vindolander tablets and the reference on one of those to the Britunculi, the nasty little Brits of the title. And it looks at native non-Roman religion. And there's a series of objects, but these particular silver plaques are the ones I want to focus on. So these are small repoussé plaques, so the decoration hammered through from the other side, depicting the native deity Cicidius. And as the label rightly highlights, the production of this deity, the production of the image and the use of these little silver votive plaques do represent a Roman, or at least an imported way of depicting and communicating with the supernatural that doesn't seem to have been present in the pre-Roman period, being applied to a native deity. So that's a valuable observation. but they're still being characterized as non-Roman religion. And one of the problems we have is that the fine context of these plaques isn't something that the display engages with. And the plaques, in fact, were found in the headquarters building of the Roman fort at Bewcastle, just north of Carlisle. So in about as solid a Roman context as you might have imagined, and clearly produced and used by the Roman soldiers at that fort. And indeed, the fort at Bewcastle, the original name of the fort, survives in later written documents, and the name of the fort was Fanum Coccidii, the Temple of Coccidius. So this local deity was clearly important to the very identity of the fort, as well as evidenced in its religious material culture. And so we see a slight complication. We see expectations that natives will adopt the classical gods. That kind of goes without saying. We have an expectation that will happen, but where there's evidence, and there is plenty of evidence of the people we might term Romans adopting native deities, that's often overlooked, or it's treated as some kind of oddity that requires greater explanation, and there's an imbalance there. The evidence like this really shows that rather than merely tolerating native deities, we see their active adoption and active veneration by imported communities, Roman military communities, for example. So there's a greater complexity there than simply the Roman tolerance of native deities and of the adoption by natives of imported new beliefs and practices. There's a much more complicated picture. And we can see that in other ways through the use of artistic styles and artistic decoration as well. So the silver plaque on the left here comes from the Barkway hoard, now in the British Museum and on display in the British Museum, where if I bring up the slightly larger image, you can see this lovely pedimented building, most likely a temple, with an image that on the face of it would appear to be Vulcan. So a figure, a smith, standing. He's wearing a little felt cap, the pileus. He's wearing his tunic with one shoulder exposed. He's holding a pair of tongs out in his right hand with a nice little pedestal brazier underneath him, and holding a hammer in his left hand. So to all intents and purposes, this is a nice, lovely depiction of the classical Vulcan, the smith god. And yet, as Ernest Black has argued, the hammer in the left hand is a very long-handled hammer, which isn't a particularly Roman style of hammer. In fact, the long hammer appears to be one of the attributes of a Gallic smith god called Succelos, and Succelos is attested in Britain as well. So we have this conflation and this combination of the classical Vulcan with the northeastern provincial deity Succelos, and this confusion perhaps as to how an individual viewer of this image and user of this plaque might have interpreted that deity. It can get more complicated with other objects as well, particularly if we didn't have inscriptions. The limestone carving on the right is from Corbridge and depicts, to all intents and purposes, the god Mercury. The figure possesses the attributes of Mercury, and if it wasn't for the inscription on the base, I think there's no doubt that we will be interpreting this figure as Mercury. However, the description tells us that this is to the god Aracurius, who's a very little-known native deity. So this danger that, whereas the imagery of Mercury has been used and adopted for Aracurius, without the inscription, we would most likely not assume any other identity. We would take the classical imagery as evidence that it was the classical deity that was being intended to be depicted. And similarly, the goddess Minerva seems to be particularly versatile in this regard. On the left here, we have the stone carving of the goddess Brigantia, so the goddess of the Brigantes of the northern parts of Britain, that presented entirely as the classical Minerva. And on the right, another plaque, this time in gold, and this time from the Ashwell hoard, but also from the British Museum, and I'll return to Ashwell in just a moment. But where the imagery of the deity standing again in a little pedimented temple is entirely that of the classical Minerva, but there is an inscription punched in underneath. It's a little bit difficult to see on the image, but there is a dedication to the deity. The Ashwell hoard actually has been very, very well published in recent years. There's a free open access version of the big publication on the Ashwell hoard by Ralph Jackson and Gilbert Burley, which is very much worth checking out. It's wonderful that that's available, open access and free. So I will give that a very well-deserved plug. It's a wonderful publication. And in that, the authors do say that when they were starting to transcribe the inscriptions, they admit that they were looking for the name Minerva. They were looking for Deo Minervae or some similar formulation of letters. And it was only when they realized that they didn't have that, they started to look deeper, and the name Sununa appeared. But the goddess Sununa being depicted entirely with the attributes and classical depiction of Minerva. So yet again, the imagery alone can be incredibly misleading for us. So just to bring that back to the Ryedale hoard, or just to reference the Ryedale hoard, where we have one of the wonderful sequence of military rider figures that we know of, kind of from mostly eastern England, from the Northamptonshire up through Lincolnshire into Yorkshire, kind of their main heartlands. We don't have inscriptions associated with these. So although they are often associated with Mars, and we absolutely can assume that at least some viewers would have considered them to be Mars, there's this wonderfully tantalizing aspect as well, that not all worshippers may have seen them or identified them in this way. And so when we see classical attributes and classical imagery being used, we do have to be careful not to make assumptions about the identities of those deities, and indeed the identities of the people worshipping them, and their varying ontological worldviews. Just to return to the Ashwell hoard and the goddess Sununa, because votive and structured deposition in general is something that's not particularly well represented in museums, I think. One of the first issues is the selection of material for display. Now, museum displays are always going to be restricted in the amount of material that they can display. There's always far more material that can never go on, and there are obviously expectations about what material will go on display. But there is a very aesthetic bias in the material that is selected. So the gold, the silver, as we see here, whereas holistic assemblages often are much more complex and often much more messy, and indeed, dare I say, a lot uglier. The ceramics that get involved, the scrappy bits of copper alloy or iron or glass, all these different bits, which clearly were significant in the composition of the holistic deposit, can easily get lost in displays as we apply our own perspective on one of the most attractive or most visual elements of the display, and they then get priority. So I think greater awareness and greater honesty about the selectivity that goes on in museum selection processes is something that might be a valuable thing to consider going forwards. We also find that acts of deposition and indeed the context of deposition are something that aren't always forefronted in displays. Very often hoards and special deposits are interpreted more through a narrative of safekeeping, that they're valuable objects, therefore people are stopping them from theft, which is not an invalid interpretation for many things, but often the ritual aspects of burial and deposition are downplayed or overlooked, perhaps as a bit more complicated, a bit more messy. But in many depositions, they're clearly there. At Ashwell, for example, as a very recently excavated and very well excavated assemblage, we have a landscape where there's a natural depression, which we know filled up and was quite boggy with water for a lot of the year. There are ranges of buildings around it, some potentially quite grand, even marbled buildings. There are ovens on the site. There are a series of depositions in and around the complex, many of which seem to begin in prehistory, and even the potential for prehistoric objects to have been deposited in the Roman period. So there's a real recognition of the longevity of activity at the site. There's a metalled track, perhaps a processional way leading alongside the edge of the bog. And so this particular deposit, the material that contained the Sununa material, is probably material from a temple assemblage. It's probably items that have been displayed in a temple, and then at some point they've been gathered up and been disposed of in the ground in this deposit, presumably respectfully, presumably as some form of offering, but done long after potentially at least a generation or more after the original donors and dedicators of those objects have died and passed on. So you have a sense of communal and social memory as well of religious objects being donated, but having a multi-generational impact and being used and deposited and viewed across generations. So a long-standing and quite complex series of depositions and activity on this particular site, that there's a danger that gets lost in the display. And the display focuses instead more closely on the deity Sununa herself, and particularly the fact that she represents a new deity for Roman Britain. This is the first and only time that the goddess Sununa has been attested, and that's an exciting thing. The discovery of a new deity is a really fascinating and wonderful discovery. But I think there's always a danger that it reinforces an approach that I think often happens in museums of demonstrating what might be termed the catalogue of gods, the idea that we focus more on the range of deities that are available in polytheistic systems, rather than considering what they potentially offered to worshippers, or how, why, when knowledge of their existence and the ritual requirements that were needed, to access them and to gain access to whatever their special powers were transmitted between people. As the religious scholar Clifford Ando once said, that gods, like dogs, will only answer to their name. You can't offer to a deity unless you know that that deity exists. And if you're in a remote, rural community somewhere, perhaps on the Yorkshire Wolds, then how many deities in reality do you know exist? You don't have the whole panoply of Roman Britain or the Roman Empire necessarily at your disposal, because you don't know they exist. So thinking more locally and more specifically about people's religious needs and what access they have to religious knowledge and particular deities, I think is another alternate way we can think about accessing, rather than thinking more broadly about these huge catalogues of different deities. Another thing that often gets overlooked when we're thinking about the deposition of objects is fragmentation and mutilation. These objects often don't go into the ground entirely whole. They can be decommissioned through deliberate damage. They can be ritually killed, is a way it's often phrased. So they can maybe pass on to another spiritual realm. But again, that's something that museums don't often pay a huge amount of attention to. We're staying in the British Museum for the image on the left. These are the Hochwald cups, these beautiful silver cups. But if you can see just to the right of the cups and at the back, there's a dark object which looks rather out of place amongst all the shininess of the rest of the display. That's a replica that was made before the original cups were reconstructed, showing the crushed form of one of the original cups. So whereas they have been beautifully reconstructed, that original damage before deposition is an important part of their biography. And there is a danger that by restoring them to their original condition, that part of the biography is lost, or at least underplayed. And indeed, the interpretation of the hoard talks about the damage, but only in terms of how difficult it made it to understand the manufacture and the decoration and the dating of the cups. It was seen as a barrier to art historical research, rather than a fascinating part of their lives as archaeological objects and as part of their deposition. So I think there's a danger there of undermining some of these very significant depositional acts. On the right-hand side, we have curse tablets, this time from Bath, which is one of the major sites of discovery of curse tablets, not only in Britain, but in the Western Roman Empire, where again we have curses. In Britain, they're usually referred to as what are known as prayers for justice, rather than being proactive curses against an enemy. These are generally more reactive, and almost universally in Britain as a result of theft. So these are pleas to a deity to seek retribution for items that have been stolen from you. But they're created, written into lead or pewter usually, which are then folded and rolled tight, sometimes pierced. And these acts seem to be quite significant to the emotive act of the creation and the final sealing and binding of the curse before they're deposited. And at Bath, that act of deposition seems to have been quite an intense one. The steamy, sulphurous waters of Bath being deposited in quite an enclosed room, so smoky, hot, smelly, and you're depositing this heartfelt folded up curse into the waters, seeing it vanish out of sight on its way to being transferred to another realm. These acts of folding and piercing are significant in that transference and the emotive experience. However, when they're displayed in museums, again, we often see it as part of a hindrance almost to reading and interpreting the text. They're often presented as examples of literary texts and valued for the written evidence they can give us about people's possessions, as much as they are instantiations of very powerful and emotive ritual acts. So I think acts of deposition, the experiences of depositing, definitely an area where museums, I think, can be engaging a lot more proactively and providing a more interesting experience maybe for visitors. To turn to the positioning of objects on display and the relative relationships of objects. These are two pictures of a trio of altars excavated at the Carabrough Mithraeum on Hadrian's Wall. The left-hand picture is the altars as they were during excavation in the early 1950s, and on the right, the reconstructions that currently exist on site and that you will see if you visit the site today. You can see that the altar on the left, the wonderful figurative altar of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, with its lovely pierced sun rays around the head, which enabled light to shine through the altar. So a wonderful performative aspect of that altar. In the excavation photos, it's missing its capital. That does exist. It's just not in that photo, and you can see it's been reconstructed on the reconstructions on the right. But what's important here is the positioning of the altars. Even though these are altars set up by individual high-status, high-ranking cult members, they work together as a trio. The altar in the center, which you can see a bit better on the one on the right, was dedicated by Lucius Antonius Proculus. You can see his name on the second and third lines, hopefully. That altar has a focus, the dish in the center, which is where the fire would have been lit. That's where the main offerings would have been burnt. And of course, the smoke curling up is how the deity is receiving their parts of the offering. The altars to the side both have flat tops. They may be what are known as mensae, which are effectively ritual tables. So they might have been used for holding ritual paraphernalia as part of ritual activities, maybe even holding offerings. It's been alternatively suggested that they could have held temporary braziers, so they could have received direct offerings themselves, or that they perhaps once held sculptural, stone sculptures, although they've never been discovered if that was the case. But the important bit being that these altars are working as a trio. However, the display of them currently in the Great North Museum does subvert that original relationship somewhat. As you can see, the figurative altar of Sol has been moved to the center. I think this is very much a reflection of a modern museum design aesthetic, where the visual balance of the figurative altar being in the center, also being the slightly narrower and taller altar, and then what might be termed the planar, entirely epigraphic altars move to the side. So a different interpretation of visual balance and visual appeal has been applied to them for the museum display, but that does serve to remove and undermine the original ritually inspired orientation of the altars in their original display, in the original temple context. So I think that, again, there's danger there of design processes changing and altering religious contexts that we can excavate. Remaining in the Great North Museum, in fact, if you turn around from looking at those three altars, for those that might know the museum, you see this display here, which is from another Mithraeum on Hadrian's Wall. This is the Mithraeum at Housesteads. And again, you can see that visual balance and symmetry has been very, very important in the construction of the display, with the tauroctony scene on the wall at the back, and then the birth of Mithras from the egg or the rock placed centrally in front. But this is an example of where material from one archaeological site is spread across the collections of multiple museums. And that, of course, in itself can present problems in interpreting the activity from that specific site. So the Housestead Site Museum itself doesn't have any stonework from the Mithraeum on display, but it does have a reconstruction drawing of the interior of the Mithraeum, and you might be able to recognize some of the original stonework at the Great North Museum in that reconstruction. But then also at the Clayton Museum at Chesters, where there is stonework from across the wall, material excavated by John Clayton. You can see there are sculptures here, the one partially cut off on the left of Mithras himself, and then statues of Cautes and Counterpartes, some of the attendants and companions of Mithras there as sculptures. And in fact, to go back to the Great North Museum main image, the statue of Cautes to the left of the birth of Mithras as we look at it actually isn't from the Housestead's Mithraeum at all. It's from another Mithraeum on Hadrian's Wall and has been placed there clearly to maintain the symmetrical balance of the display. It's interpreted as coming from a different site, but on visual balance, it looks as if it belongs with the other material. And clearly the statues, the other original sculptures being in the Chesters Museum, has denied the potential for it to be there at the Great North Museum. So these problems of any visitor being able to get a holistic picture of what was happening at that Mithraeum is denied by very historic museum collecting practices that have split material up between different museums. So another factor to bear in mind when we're telling the narratives of religious sites, and indeed some of the problems that museums can face when collections and historic collecting practices have influenced what's available to any one institution. Stay with museum visitors and thinking about their attitudes. It's not uncommon, of course, to come across landscape sites, archaeological sites, and find offerings placed in them, modern offerings. This is to return to the Carabrough Mithraeum and that central altar of Lucius Antonius Proculus. This was a photograph I took a couple of years ago, but any visit on virtually any given day will see various offerings left at the site. Now, whether these are genuine offerings to the pagan deity is debatable. Some, I think, certainly will be. Others are more the more modern social phenomenon of leaving offerings at site, and when one offering's been placed, others tend to follow it. Although there is evidence, Richard Hingley a few years ago published an article with a picture of this exact same altar where there was a Jehovah's Witness token placed in there. So somebody had clearly felt that they didn't want to make an offering to the pagan deity, but clearly felt that other people were doing that and wanted to leave their own religious message there in contrast to that. So there is, very contemporary religious implication for some of these offerings. We don't tend to see these sorts of offerings being left in museums very often. That's, I think, partially because of museum behavioural expectations that leaving things on objects in museums is a cultural no-no. It does happen, but I think when it does, museum front of house staff tend to be fairly efficient at clearing things away, and little coins that are left will end up in the donation box fairly quickly. So it becomes a little bit of a hidden practice, and there's not a lot of documentation as to where and when it happens. But this idea of people interacting with ancient religious material on religious grounds is a really interesting one, and certainly an understudied one. The journal known as the Pomegranate is a journal dedicated to pagan studies, and actually the latest edition of that journal is dedicated to pagans and museums. And in the introduction to that, Caroline Tully made a really interesting observation when she wrote that, unlike more established, well-known religions or First Peoples forms of spirituality, contemporary pagans are frequently not taken seriously by museums. A religious relationship with ancient objects and people, separated from contemporary pagan practitioners, sometimes by thousands of years, is often not accepted as authentic, and it may appear contrived or made up. And I think that is absolutely true, that whereas there's been some interesting work in recent years on how modern contemporary religious believers of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, how they react with their religious material culture in museums, and how the museumification of religious objects influences their religious nature, there hasn't been a similar interest in how pagans interact and engage with more ancient religious objects in museums. But there is, again, evidence that this is something that does happen. For example, a blog here that I came across online while doing research for the PhD, written by Alorna Smithers in 2016, and this describes her visit to the Border Gallery at Tully House Museum. The photographs at the bottom are my images, not hers, but they are images of the display cases that she was looking at the time. And she wrote, "I'd seen many sketched in Anne Ross's Pagan Celtic Britain and wasn't prepared to see them all together at once. It was overwhelming and rather peculiar seeing them packed into 4 cabinets, some headless, limbless, or defaced. I managed to get my act together and speak their names, those I knew, those I didn't. Images of deities sculptured 2,000 years ago, revered, now viewed in an entirely different context." I think that's a really perceptive reminder of just how we often do see ancient religious material culture as effectively a subcategory of archaeological find. Religion is a subcategory of archaeological find for most of us when we're viewing it in museums or if we're working in museums. And it is a powerful reminder, I think, that not all of our visitors are necessarily seeing it in that way, that these objects do retain some very active numinous power for some visitors. And I think that's something that we should strive to understand more and engage with, I think, a bit more openly and proactively. It's an interesting line of future research, I think. That's not to say that things are always being done badly in museums, and it's certainly not to say that there aren't some really interesting and very recent display interventions and projects that I think are really showing a changing direction of travel and a recognition of how religion might be displayed. This is the Great North Museum, and I think it was last year, maybe late the year before, where they've introduced a light projection, so video projections onto a bank of their altars. Stone altars are very difficult to display. They tend to get homogenized into this kind of creamy grey expanse, and they lose the fact that they are individual objects, set up by different people at different times in different places for different needs, and served as very visible reminders of those religious offerings and acts to any future people. They almost become models for how religious activity might be performed in future, but say they can lose a lot of that personality. And these individual projections, I think, really help to reverse that. Not only do they reintroduce colour to the altars and bring them back to life, but the video projections show images of the deities that they're being that they were erected to honour, or they show elements of those deities' personalities and areas of divine influence. So it's a video projection to watch a number of times over to almost see each altar and where the video projection goes. It's very high quality production. But there's one that I want to focus on particularly, which is just to the right of centre, that the large squat altar to Fortuna, which is actually set up in a bathhouse. And the video projection on here, of which there are a few stills, actually shows an offering being made onto that very altar. So you have the silhouette figure lifting a jug and pouring a jug of blood onto the altar, and then that blood spilling over the sides of the altar and running down the sides. And as it does that, the blood pours down the whole altar itself. So a nice way of connecting that depicted religious act with the real altar. And as it eventually gets completely covered in blood, I think a nice, subtle, maybe not so subtle in some ways, but subtle in others, reminder of actually just how messy and sticky and smelly, and in some ways rather quite horrible many of these religious offerings can be, compared to the rather stone, the calm, placid stone that we see today. So I think these start to bring some of these acts back to life in a really wonderful way. So I do recommend going to see those if it's possible for you to travel to Newcastle upon Tyne. Another recent intervention of last year is at Tully House in the Border Gallery, where new graphics have been introduced behind a display of altars. Altars, again, being these difficult things to display. And if I just focus on this one here, you can see that the graphic has really brought one specific altar into a much better context. So you've got the officiant there pouring from a little patera onto the altar, the smoke starting to curl up, and as I mentioned before, that's the offering itself, that the smell and the smoke is the god getting their particular part of that offering delivered to them. That's something that the interpretation very much focuses on. But again, involving the rather dead stone altar back into a living religious context. So fairly simple in many ways as an intervention, but I think quite powerful and effective for getting visitors to think about these objects as living religious objects, and what their actual function really was. So to bring this to a close, I want to turn to the Ryedale hoard display itself, which is a wonderful exhibition. I hope that many of you have had the chance to go and see the displays, or will be able to before it closes. The case here is actually of the hoard objects themselves, and I think one thing that's really lovely about the display and kind of works on multiple levels is that the hoard objects themselves are hidden from you as you walk in. You don't get to see them until the end of the display and walk behind a screen with a video projection to actually see them. So that obviously serves to kind of make sure that the pièce de résistance of the display isn't spoiled as soon as you walk in. There's a lovely build up to seeing the star objects. But I think conversely, from a live religion perspective, it's also really powerful because the main body of the exhibition, as we'll look at in a moment, is dedicated to the individuals who created the hoard and looking at who the people were that brought this together. So I think it also works on the level of introducing the people first, the agentic individuals who are making these decisions and carrying out the act before the objects then come in. So I think that's a really nice way of putting individuals first. So that display decision for me works really well on both levels. But I mentioned the individuals, and as I say, from a live religion perspective, formatting the display around the potential depositors and using the objects to look at their potential identities is for me a really powerful and wonderful way of thinking about individuals and individual agents. Whether the deposition is religious or not, depending on how you want to interpret it, it's still really powerful to think about it from that direction and to recenter the individuals. And really nicely, of course, visitors are invited to think about the interpretative process, to look at those displays and give their own considerations about how we can go from these quite mysterious and strangely juxtaposed objects to thinking back to the original people. And archaeology, as we know, is an intensely subjective process of interpretation. That's a really powerful way, I think, of bringing visitors into that decision-making process. And I was also particularly taken with the animations that are running in the side. There was a side project to work with animation students at York St John University. So a series of different animations looking at the objects and how they might have been deposited and buried and what some of the motivations might have been behind them, which not only, apart from being technically very, very impressive, particularly to a Luddite as much as myself, as I am, but to kind of use this more creative way of thinking about motivations and to think about the actual acts of deposition, which, despite our best interpretation, traditional label-based interpretation can only go so far. So thinking of new and more creative ways of bringing these decisions and actions to life is really, really powerful. And the use of creative language is something that I also looked at in the PhD, and I was really pleased to see, again, if we go back to these panels, that the yellow text as the introductory text is first-person text. It's putting words into the mouths of ancient individuals. And although that can carry its own inherent risks, as I say, I think it opens up the idea that archaeology is this intensely subjective process. And I think it's good to be brave and proactive and acknowledge that and to bring ancient individuals and bring them to life and to explore what their potential motivations might have been. I think, ironically, rather than being risky, I think that's a really open and honest interpretative process that can be incredibly engaging for visitors. It's something that doesn't happen at many museums. It only happened at a few of the museums that I surveyed for the research. So the Museum of London, for example, has a series of poetry panels across its Roman Britain gallery. These were set up, I think, in 2012, actually as part of the Cultural Olympics that went alongside the London Olympics. But one of those poems, a poem titled Curses by Jonathan Ladd, talks about the emotion inherent in creating and depositing a curse. And you get this sense of frustration and anger and almost joyful glee at the thought of the retribution that might be enacted upon the victim by the deity. I have to say, I think it's the single most powerful and emotive bit of interpretation about cursing in any of the museums that I've come across, coming from what I assume is a non-archaeologist poet. I think it really shows the creative power of language to get across the emotions of ancient religious acts. In the centre, the Great North Museum has a series of what they call people portals, with a dressed reenactor showing a character, and then a panel at the bottom with them making, again, a first-person statement about their life, their beliefs, their activities. So again, this powerful way of giving life and voice to what might otherwise be very dead names inscribed on it, on objects. And then finally on the right, at National Museum of Scotland, which unusually is a thematically arranged display. So items of different historic periods and archaeological periods are grouped together in themes. But at the entrance to every thematic section, there is one of these emotively written kind of creative sentences, so paragraphs and panels that give a bit of life and context to the people living at the time. So I think it's not used anywhere near enough in displays. I think it has the potential to be really powerful, to challenge the way people think about people's opinions and life and varying views and ontologies about religion and the supernatural. And so it's really lovely to see it being used more. Just to bring things to a close, one thing I finished with in the research was a series of rather grandly titled principles. I couldn't think of a better word. It sounds very arrogant to call them that. But it's a series of thoughts that perhaps condensed everything down for museums that are maybe hoping or wanting to look at religion in a different way, that maybe these might spark discussion points between them. I haven't had a chance to go into all of these in the talk today, but just to quickly run through them. The idea that terminology requires definition, that terms such as religion and ritual are intensely culturally specific, but at no museums that I studied were any of these terms actually defined or discussed. So we're very much leaving visitors to bring their own very modern concepts of these terms and apply them to the ancient world. And I think there's a danger there. So I think greater recognition of contextualizing these terms is important. To avoid presenting hierarchies of Roman and native beliefs and practices, to consider that religious material culture, religious objects, don't just demonstrate internal beliefs, but they are constitutive of them. People don't have internal beliefs that they then express through material culture, but the objects they use in their religious practices help form and shape their inner beliefs. Material culture is part of that process. That museums wanting to display religion in any way need to look at their documentation processes. The process doesn't just begin when a display is being constructed or when the text is being written. It goes right back to the underlying documentation in the museum process. That's how we need to think about about religion differently. That beliefs weren't universal and they certainly weren't tension-free, but they required transmission and maintenance by agentic individuals, enacting rituals, telling people their thoughts, things traveling with people. That centering the needs and experiences of individuals rather than focusing on the catalogues of deities that I mentioned, I think is an important way of thinking about religion in a different way. That creative, perhaps storytelling language can be used to challenge more traditional perspectives of the period and of people's lives and beliefs and worldviews. That the way and means in which objects are deposited into the ground is as significant in their biographies as the heyday of their use. That every religious act was potentially unique and more importantly, could influence future performances of that and other acts. That the materiality and the embodied use of objects is as significant as their iconography. So it's not just what's written on objects or what pictures they depict, but how they're used, what they're made of. These could carry great magical and religious and ritual significance and prove as much a part of their efficacy as the pictures on them. That interactives in museums, they're often aimed at children and families, that museums should perhaps consider making them accessible for all ages, that there's great potential with involving the senses and involving more tactile handling activities to get people to think about religious objects in different ways, how they're used, how they feel, how they smell, etc. And that finally, for some visitors, religious objects are far from being dead, but retain often very potent and very live numinous power, and that we should try and involve these sorts of people as well in our perceptions of our displays and how we consider religion. But I will bring things to a close at that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That was absolutely fascinating. A real deep dive into what I think you've shown is an incredibly large, complex and diverse topic. I was quite struck by how it's not forced me, but allowed me to reflect on my own curatorial practice and some of the Romano-British displays that I've been involved with before. And I think actually taking a step back and thinking about the reasons behind why some of these I think repetitive themes that appear in Roman displays, taking a step back and thinking why is quite an important thing. And that was I should say to everyone, please do get your questions in to Anthony. Add them into the comments on Facebook and on YouTube, and I'll be able to see them on my screen here. And I wanted to start with a big and difficult question, I'm afraid.
Excellent.
Let's start. So I think what I found it really interesting, and especially I think this was encapsulated in your set of principles at the end. There seems to be many themes that you've identified across different displays and collections as to how this topic is presented. I don't think religion is probably the only theme that's presented in some of these ways. And I wanted to ask if you were able to identify any kind of underlying reasons why you think that museums present religion in this way. And then as a part two to that, I wondered if you could see any changes perhaps, any improvements coming through in newer museums and galleries compared to more historic displays?
Yeah, yes, it's the big questions, isn't it? I think in some cases, design processes often remove innovation from galleries. I think the more hands and the more eyes things go through, perhaps things do, revert to being more conservative and more traditional. I think some of it is just the paradigms are so well ingrained. Just that approach to it, the way we think about the Roman world. I think even when people are consciously trying to do things in a different way,
Mm.
they're just so culturally ingrained within us that it can sometimes be difficult to shake them, even if we're not hoping to do it. But there is some really interesting direction of travel. I say, I think the bits I kind of highlighted at Tully House and the Great North Museum, and even like the museums on Hadrian's Wall that English Heritage have redone in more recent years. Kind of Chester's and Corbridge and
Mm.
but Oswald. Um, have shown a really nice direction of travel into more engaging ways of thinking about religion. I'm going to preempt any other questions or anything coming in, but I think what I hope is that it's something that doesn't necessarily require masses of money or funding, or because obviously that's one of the big things is that museums do not have a lot of resources and perhaps less now than ever. But when displays are being redone and rethought of, hopefully it's just some of those. It's at the design process that I think a lot of the changes need to be made, and it's how we think about integrating religion into different aspects of displays, and how we use language, not necessarily making longer labels or more complex
Mm.
interpretation, but just how do we use these concepts to maybe challenge people. I think it's like a lot of things in museums. If you visit a museum, the ones I think that are most memorable are not necessarily the ones that present you with a massive facts, but they're the ones that maybe make you think differently about something. You walk out thinking, I'd never thought about it from that perspective before. Maybe that's the more powerful aspect to it.
I think the examples that you chose, I think was it at the Great North Museum and then at Tully House, of just
Literally,
those
yes.
quite simple interventions that completely transformed the way that, I mean, all Roman museums display lots of stone altars, and I think probably lots of visitors walk past them without giving them a second glance sometimes, and actually simple graphic additions. And in the case of Tully House, very carefully designed and thought out, but probably not huge budgets required, can really transform a display. I think one of the things that's really got me thinking is just how much religion is a kind of experiential and active thing. People do it. They don't write about it. They don't. Well, they think about it, but it's an active thing. And I wondered if um, that kind of active nature had come across in any of the museums that you'd visited, perhaps through interactives or immersive experiences potentially.
Yeah, I mean, interactives are difficult. I didn't kind of go into interactives in this, but there is one that I will highlight, which is at the Clayton Museum in Chester's, which I think and hope is working. I think it suffered a little bit from the problem that all interactives suffer from, which is once they start to break, they can be very difficult and expensive to bring back in. But it's interesting for those that don't know the Clayton Museum at Chester's. It's very deliberately a Victorian style museum. It's reflecting the Victorian ethos of Clayton as a collector. So it is very much a display of mass stonework in the main room. So I think it's quite interesting that that's the museum that I think is presenting one of the more innovative religious ideas. And what it is when you walk into the museum, you're presented with a shrine, like an idiculum, and you have the goddess Juno introduce herself to you and ask you to take a lamp. And there's these little wooden lamps, so physical, tangible wooden lamps with a nice bit of weight to them that you pick up, and it's got 3 lights in it. And she lights up your 3 lamps, the 3 lights in your lamp, and you take that around the museum with you. And there's a selection of altars to various deities that have just got a little panel next to them, and you basically choose the 3 deities that you want to offer to by physically holding up your lamp to the card, and a little light on the lamp goes out when you've chosen. And it feels like quite a strangely momentous moment that you've made this selection and can't go back on it. And when you've been around and chosen your 3, you go back to the little idiculum, you put your lamp on. She kind of thanks you for your offerings, and you get a little printout that tells you a bit about the 3 deities that you've chosen. And just the idea of religious choice and of going around and making that selection and thinking about the different deities and what the implications might have been, I found that really fascinating. And I know from talking to some people at English Heritage as well that they've kind of felt that people have kind of taken it quite seriously, and I think it's the tactile nature of it. If it was just maybe an iPad or just pressing some buttons, I don't think it would have the same impact as physically carrying this little weighty wooden lamp around. It really gave it some emotive weight as well as physical weight. So that I think was really interesting, and I hope that's going, because I'd love to see some research on how and why people are engaging with certain deities and what's involving the choices they're making. Why are they doing what they're doing, and are they just choosing the biggest altars and where they're positioned, or is there actually something deeper going on about which deities are speaking to them in a certain way?
There's
So
certainly a good research project there, isn't there?
maybe so, yeah.
That's a
Get my bid
fantastic
in to go and doing that.
example. I think it's kind of placing the visitor in the experience, which is what I think transforms interpretation of this theme. So I'm hogging all the questions. I do apologise. Let's move on to some questions that we've received from our viewers. So first of all, from Elizabeth from Facebook, Antony, have you written any papers that summarise this discussion? She can see it being really useful for her classics degree. So if viewers have found your talk really, really interesting, where can they go out and find more information about this topic?
On this, well, at the moment I'm in the process of writing this up. It was going to first thing to get the PhD done and out of the way. I've now got a couple of publications that I'm working on about it. So hopefully in the next year or so there will be some bits in print that summarize various aspects of this. So I'm sorry to say at the moment there isn't anything, but if I can be of any help with anything for your ongoing studies, then please do find me and get in touch. I'll be glad to be of any help I can be. But at the moment, this specifically hasn't appeared anywhere. But yeah, it will do soon, and hopefully it won't be torn to shreds.
Thank you, Antony. That's a very kind offer. I'm sure Elizabeth will be taking you up on that. We have a question from Margaret Rogers. She was wondering if the goddess Venus was included on your chart of important gods.
It wasn't included on that, but I've nothing against Venus particularly on that. It was wanting to keep it to a certain number and wanting to try and get a broad representation of deities to see what people would have responded. So yeah, Venus wasn't on there, but yeah, it wasn't intended to be completely inclusive of every deity in Roman Britain. I am pretty certain if it had been on there, she would have been right up
Would
there.
have been quite high up on the list, I would imagine.
Yeah, one of the iconic ones, definitely.
We have a question from Andrew Woods. Now, you've spoken about a couple of case studies from your visits that really worked. And Andrew asks, if time and money was completely unlimited, how would you like museums to display Romano-British religion?
Yeah, that's always one of the things there that I suppose I've always not feared Andrew's question, but feared that sense of curators particularly saying, oh, well, yeah, if we had £10,000 and an unlimited budget, everything, we could do amazing things. And I hope that these things don't require, as we've just discussed, don't require masses of resources to change things. But there is obviously great potential in technology. If the resources were there for technology, then things such as augmented reality and virtual reality do offer huge potential for more immersive religious experiences. Having said that, I think I would like to see them integrated with objects more. I think there's often a danger that once you put on a VR headset and start walking around a reconstructed Roman temple, for example, it still remains very visual. It's still what you're seeing. And I think interactive experiences that still involve objects, that still involve a sense of tactile space, that still get the sense of what your feet are sounding like on the surfaces and what they feel like and what the textures are and what the smells are and what you might be holding or touching in your hands. I think finding a way to make it immersive in a fully sensory way is very important. The thing we can't do, of course, is getting to the mindset of people in the past, and that's a danger with fully immersive experiences, is that they can feel incredibly real and powerful, but it's still our own minds and our own ontological perspectives on the world that we're projecting. So they can be very deceptive in the power that they give. So yeah, I don't know what the perfect display is, but I think something that is certainly, as I say, more more tactile, and not just handling activities. I think that are, we do handling activities in museums, of course we do, and obviously we're quite restricted generally to more robust and more common types of objects. It would be nice to find ways to maybe offer more handling experiences in smaller group settings to more visitors. And I think to think about the tactile properties of objects in a different way, not just to think about how heavy they are or how smooth they are, but and I'm saying this is something that that's been discussed with religious objects and like jet gorgonea that your colleague Andrew Parker has written about, that the rubbing of them, the touching of them to activate them, thinking about object handling in that sort of way. What's the material actually doing? What does it feel like when you rub it and it gives you an electrostatic charge? And handling it in that sort of way as well. But it's not
All
easy.
of these,
Objects are
yes,
fragile.
all of these things to think about. And we've just had a question from YPS Geology from YouTube that kind of sums that up. Would the curators allow the precious objects to be handled?
Yeah,
And I
that's
think the answer is yes, we would, but we would probably choose those objects quite carefully. So visitors that do come to the Yorkshire Museum and to the National Museum of Scotland, I'm sure, can get hands-on with real objects on object handling tables. But some objects and materials are more suitable for that than others. But yeah, absolutely, getting hands-on with real objects and materials is such an important part of that process.
Yeah, and
I'd
I think
like
I would say, as an adult going to a museum, don't just see them as child friendly. Even if, like in a lot of museums, they are presented as things for child. No, go pick up the objects, handle them. They're lovely. Go
Absolutely. Same goes for all interactives as well. We always make sure that our historical dressing up is provided in both child and adult sizes. And I tell you what, the adult sizes get used a lot more.
Good to hear. But yeah, I think that's something we need to normalize, definitely.
Absolutely. Yes, museums. We need to bring back the fun in museums, don't we?
Absolutely. Yeah, they should be about engagement and enjoyment and of say thinking about things in new ways. Yeah, not just about the accumulation of facts. It should be about opening up your mind to new ideas and new worldviews and perspectives. Definitely.
Absolutely. Well, that was absolutely fascinating, Anthony. Thank you so much for contributing your time on this rainy Thursday evening. I'm going to bring the period of questions to a close, and I'm sure we're all joining together in a virtual round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before we disappear, I'll just remind everybody that this is one of a series of lectures all online that we're hosting as part of our Ryedale Hoard programme. The next talk, I've got this written down, I should refer to my notes. Our next talk will be a curator-led talk on metalworking in Rome and Yorkshire, and this will be online at 5:30 on Thursday the 15th of December. Do go to our website. You can see a list of all the forthcoming talks, and you can also see links to the talks that you may have missed that you can catch up with on YouTube. And I hope that myself and Anthony might have persuaded you to visit maybe your local Roman museum, so you can go and critique their displays with all of your new theoretical knowledge, but also that we might have encouraged you to visit the Yorkshire Museum and see the Ryedale Hoard on display. I do hope to see you soon. Thank you for joining us.